Baba Yaga's lair was concealed far inside a towering trees in a gloomy ancient forest, preventing the sun from reaching their narrowed roots, bending like the earth's fingers. Few ventured close to it, and even fewer nevertheless gave back the witch's reputation. Baba Yaga's lair was renowned for being a strong, elderly woman, being who was in charge of the actual forces of nature as a frightening and terrifying thing. Baba Yaga's lair was revered throughout realms. The sight of the chicken legs at the top was unsettling, a reminder of her strength and capacity to bend everything around her to suit her needs. Crossing Baba Yaga was tantamount to inviting death. However, the forest wasn't the only thing that made her feared that. It was her capacity to defend what was hers, her magic, her domain, life, which included having a dog as a pet. The dog, unlike others, did not always been hers, but with time it evolved into, it wasn't a separate aspect of her world. It was a creature that was only kept as a pet. An unknown being who shared her mysterious abilities was magic. Baba Yaga's association with the forest had discovered the puppy while on one of her several explores the world of mortals. In its spirit was wild, but she was drawn to noble, brought the animal into her embrace, enabling it to move freely inside the lines of her lair's devotion. Without a doubt, the dog wasn't your typical fierce, was a beast with an independent mentality. Despite being as wild as the witch herself, it understood its role and served as a guardian of separates Baba Yaga from any unwanted presence. It triggers a danger alert. The canine had joined the witch's complex network of power, one of the numerous strands that kept her dominion intact. However, in the real world, it was only a dog in the mortal realm, not much more than a stray animal strolling in the forest. That is, until a hunter witnessed it. When a group of men discovered it, they were confident that such were not universally hunters. Hunters aren't very noteworthy independently, yet they carried with them a self-assurance derived from notes of conceit, of the perilous woods of animals and ghosts that wander across the dark forest, but they disregarded them, calling them superstitious. No, they said, tales told to pique travelers' interest. The forest at bay served just as a location to oppress, only hunt on that awful day. They went farther than they had previously. Prior to the thick appearing to swallow the entire range of bird noises and piercing sounds of rustling leaves is replaced with an eerie until they spotted the dog, there was stillness. That something was ever taken into consideration. Perhaps the creature was amiss. Not like the untamed dogs. They'd found its eyes in other forests shone with a strange intelligence, and it gave a low growl, warning them. It has a danger from a wild animal that could assault if one of the hunters was provoked. A brazen young man made the decision to take action. His conceit impaired his judgment and led him to his discretion, and in front of his friends could stop him, he sprang at the canine. Attempting to catch, trap, or place down, the others paused, recognizing the danger, but the dog arrived too late, protected itself, and in a snarl and claws, the men stood over it, and it was dead. The animal's heavy breathing is unclear, whether to feel relieved or anxious. The beast has been slain, but something regarding the sensation of leaving the woodland seemed to change the air around them, gaining weight as if the very ground had observed what they were doing. They were separated from their home and had recently killed something significant without realizing it. Importance of what they were unaware of was that the canine's owner was a master whose Baba Yaga's anger was difficult to avert, would not put up with this cruel deed, not when something so dear was involved. The news of the dog's passing touched her deeply, would eventually be carried by and reach her. The trees themselves and the whispering winds that catered to her wishes, the males lacking a glimpse of the storm they recently released, proceeded on their journey without realizing the imminence of fate was upon them. The relationship between Baba Yaga and the dog was profound. It was a bond rather than merely affection. Everything in her universe had a power dynamic. Find a position in the complex network of the dog, held the key to both life and death, preserving that equilibrium till its demise, despite appearing insignificant to the males. a challenge and an insult to her authority to the natural order that was under her authority when she would remind them. Why? When the time came. Why was her name mentioned in whispers? The very mention of her made me frightened. Those who dared to cross in their hearts. The chase had just started for her, and she would do whatever it took to get back what was hers. And there were no hunters. They weren't renowned warriors, but they were remarkable. They weren't magicians with great magic. They were a group of men with aspirations who believed they were familiar with the country and its risks, as many people do after spending in the wild. They had heard for a few years tales of spirits in the forest concerning odd animals, and they rejected them as fantastical tales that intended they were hunters to frighten kids. Ultimately, terror had no place in their environment, but conceit has a way of preventing others from seeing the true risks hiding in the environment that drew them in the woodland. Not out of interest, but necessity. Their most recent hunt had been unsuccessful, and their domestic families required cuisine that they had heard about odd creatures in the middle of the forest. Creatures more powerful and vicious than any found. It appeared to be the ideal chance to demonstrate their ability to make substitutions, to make up for their recent shortcomings. The dog A. They had never seen such a beast before. Just one more thing standing in their way. It was an untamed creature that would endanger their remaining hunting. If left unchecked, it wasn't very big. Moreover, it appeared to have no remarkable qualities at first look. It might have been a lost or abandoned stray, but it's just a growl, nothing more. Was frightening, yet not out of the ordinary in the eye. Once they gave it little thought. They didn't think those eyes were odd, unsettling eyes that shone with another feature. One of the males had an unusual level of intelligence. Björk, a young hunter, was fast to act, impetuous, bold, and brimming with self-assurance. He considered himself a competent tracker who could manage any animal that approached him. He didn't, however, contemplated killing the dog. Would be same to sending out any other untamed creature that dares. Recall the mercy. They kill the sacrifice, commanded the warrior. Challenge him. It occurred so fast. Hardly had time for the others to. Jarek swung his knife forward to process it, with the intention of putting an end to the animal's life before it became a serious danger. The dog snapped back in response, jaws more quickly than anticipated, and in and immediately, after Jarek's knife was knocked. The dog didn't merely defend from his hand. It deliberately assaulted itself. The movements were exact, violent, and computed just a matter of seconds. It had pinned Jolt to the floor. His screams were engulfed by the thick woodland as the other men hurried to remove the dog. But the young man's time was past. In seconds, life had ended, and his body was limp, and the rest remained standing in the dirt, staring at the dead dog with a frozen expression. The startling haze of violence, they having previously witnessed death in haunts and battles. But this one was unique, absurd. This wasn't merely a monster. In an attempt to defend itself, this was something extra, something that was already aware what was causing the quiet that was dense and oppressive. And they examined the dog's body uneasily. Then, unsure of what to do with one another, Jarek left after that, and there was no method to temporarily bring him back. Shock faded and was replaced by a developing feeling of fear that they hadn't just murdered something, was killed by the dog. Crucial, but crucial to those who are afraid, started to creep into their thoughts. These woods has a reputation for having the odd incidents that might send any man who was fleeing for his life. Hadn't thought about this previously and hadn't taking the narrative seriously. They gazed at the woods. Around them, the dense branches that seemed to change with the wind, the eerie silence that has collapsed. The air in the woodland felt electric, as though the land itself was hesitating. Eric, one of the older hunters, had viewed more of the globe than the majority of them, was the initial one to speak after hearing the rumors. But he'd always thought that were only rumors. But they are now confirmed. Among the curiously oppressive, he wasn't entirely certain that we shouldn't have killed it, he said in a quiet voice, as though raising one's voice would incite only a dog in the forest itself. One of the others, Leaf, a younger man, attempted to ignore it. There's no need to be alarmed. However, Eric was already scanning the area, anxiously looking around the forest as if Something should have jumped out at Leaf. Surely, the shadows appear. This is wrong. That animal wasn't simply a dog, he said. I'm not sure what it was, but it wasn't. Leaf sneered, despite the uncertainty. Just a dog. Fear was infiltrating his chest. They had spent hours searching far into the woodland that the others were beginning to acquire an unaccustomed fear. No one more than the wildlings who had ever dreamed that they were proud and strong as well, although none of them really recognized the seriousness of what they had completed, and none of them knew who the dog was. A living member of the woodland, the dog had before noticed that the temperature dropped. Trees started to appear even more gloomy, and the route they had previously taken felt unknown. The men are now doubting their decision, was unsure about their location. Moving, they were unsure on how to get out of the... They went into a trap without realizing it. The forest was alive, and it possessed no planning to allow them to go at. The group suddenly entered a spooky vicinity. There was silence, no wind, and no bird sound. Just their own crushing weight, anxiety that anything was about to happen to them, couldn't outrun. But nobody was aware of it. The actual intensity of their storm. Eventually, the dog was slain. But there had been much more to the dog than they couldn't have predicted. The realization that struck slowly, akin to a rope being tightened. They had gone too far, and now they were completely beyond salvation. Baba Yaga was aware of the disruption earlier. Even the winds had whispered it. Death of a creature who was bonded to her dog's spirit, and magic had permeated the woodland like a ferocious storm. There was a strong bond with the forests. Understanding the land's fundamental structure and the high spirit of life, having something so important taken away, did not remain unseen. The trees trembled. The trees trembled. The earth shook, and the air itself thickened with the assurance that she stood in her lair in retaliation. Location that time hasn't affected her eyes squinting as she extended her hand through the lair. She was bound to the world by magic, felt when the spirit of her pet slipped. Its life was extinguished like a candle. Anger rose inside her amid the wind, as cold and sharp as a sword's blade. This was more than just a pet's death. Was a slight on her authority, and a contestation of her authority over the woodland. The same area that had thrived felt traumatized now that she was in control of. Despite being injured as well, she was far away from the person who killed her dog, Reach, but Baba Yaga would not survive that. Didn't have to be near her to get her. Her magic, vengeance, extended throughout the woodland like a web, and in a few seconds she previously followed them. It wasn't a question. The query of whether she would locate them was just a question of when she shut her eyes. Sensing the earth's pulse below, the woods murmured to her at her feet, directing her and pointing out the way the men had already overcome their dread. Thick and tangible when it reached her, spreading through the environment like a poison woodland. They weren't stupid enough to believe that they could get away, but they still thought they had time, but they were unsure. Who they'd offended and what they'd... Baba Yaga's disturbed thoughts shifted to Chili as she started to become mentally ready. It was a source of evil magic, and she, drawn on its depths, it was shaped with an accuracy that only a being like her could. She commanded the forest to do what she wanted, its creatures changing, shadows stirring. She would inform them with a clear and concise statement that no one crossed her without incurring any costs. The first thing she would do was make sure they knew she was there. But she must not yet confront them directly. They had prepared the groundwork for their own death. Her authority would start to appear gradually and gently. When she twisted the hold to her, the forest will be the world around them. Was her area of expertise, and she would ensure they were aware that it would take time. Wouldn't be tidy, but she had time, so she would cause them to suffer because of their ignorance of the ground beneath the hunter's feet. Started moving the object that had formerly a well-traveled route, now appeared to strangely twisted, as though the forest itself had changed into something. The air became thick and heavy, indistinguishable, with a tightness from which they were unable to break. The trees appeared to be getting closer to their branches that resembled twisted fingers extending. The men are already trembling down toward them. By their companions passing, they started to experience the consequences of Baba Yaga's anger. They sensed that someone was observing them. Just over the edge, something is waiting. The suffocating silence of their vision that had seized the forest now started to break. That was replaced by a noise. Something moving, shifting in the darkness. The dogs passing had occurred just out of sight. Merely the spark of Baba Yaga's enchantment was methodical and slow, but it was the men are stuck in the woods everywhere. Previously, they believed they knew were now encircled by powers they were unable to understand. The forest creatures, long under her sway, awoke from their hiding spots. They weren't animals. Not how the hunters perceived it. They served as manifestations of Baba Yaga's wishes, quiet onlookers who executed her orders without hesitation. Much like the men, as the weight of their fear increased, they no longer had the sense of being hunters in the forest. They were untamed, like prey lost in a world. Where the regulations had abruptly altered, it seemed as though the jungle itself had arrived, living to torture them. Twisted shadows, shapes that moved strangely just outside the extent of their vision, and odd, unnatural noises reverberated around the trees. Wherever they went, the forest appeared to close in on them. Driving them farther into the center of Baba Yaga did not have to enter her realm. She knew they wouldn't last long, so she hurried. Since the hunt had already started, she would allow them to continue to run and allow their assays to prey upon the dead. As their desperation grew, they would soon learn enough that nobody managed to get away from Baba Yaga's The Witch's Forest. No retribution here. Authority was absolute, and it would had them on their knees because they had murdered her dog, but the true penalty would arrive once they understood that in these woods, nothing would ever be the same again. Likewise, the trees, the ground, and the wind itself would all work together to create certainty that they understood death to be the only escape, and there was no assurance of that. Baba Yaga remained still, her gaze fixated. How her thoughts about the far-off horizon purposefully honed, she possessed all the possibilities the forest would deal with. The forest would deal with time in the world, with them in its own time and manner. However, when the time came for them to ultimately recognize the cost of their acts, they would plead for their lives, and I wouldn't grant it too fast. But the insight came just in time. Gently strike the hunter like a weight, initially applying pressure on their chest, was merely an uneasiness and a nod. The air at the periphery of their minds had been thickened with something they were unable to identify, but as they moved, as you get more into the forest, the feeling of his wrongness increased. They had gone too far, one that they were unaware of till too late. The elderly men who had additional crazy experience had started to recognize it before the younger ones do. Eric had witnessed more oddities than though he wanted to recall. This was distinct. It wasn't just the woods. This was something else, acting out. Something more sinister, something intimate. He could sense it in the trees, encircled them in the manner that the very flowers in the ground appeared to move beneath your feet. Initially subtle, just enough to make them question each move they took, and then it became intolerable. This leaf requested. His voice quivering a little as he looked anxiously around, the back hairs of his neck rose. He had been elevated. In the woodland, although this wasn't Eric, muttered his customary, "I told you." The words were low, nearly growling. It was too bad to do this, yet it was. The golden moonlight streamed through the pool trees, and if he looked, the dog's death was the first to occur, late. Ere the forest had been observing since then, and now they were imprisoned in a profound feeling of fear over them, making the air more dense with each minute by minute. The route they had traveled, the following, didn't feel familiar anymore. Then came the sound of climbing. It had twisted in ways they were unaware of, as if the actual woodland had shifted, its roots moving under the surface, its limbs tearing at the heavens in odd new perspectives that the men attempted to convince themselves it was only the wind. The land's wild unpredictability, but not even the bravest of them were able to shake the increasing terror that is eating away at their bones. The silence was broken by Eric's voice. "Isn't that witch Bab-Ya hurting?" Just the name was sufficient to make the others wince, but none of them spoke, saying it out loud. Of course, they had heard the stories. Old men's stories from distant villages murmured warnings from the jungle. Passing from one generation to the next, they had consistently disregarded them, thinking themselves impervious to this ancient enchantment. But when the woodland twisted and appeared to come to life all around them, and they understood how incorrect, the younger hunters had been involved, attempted to dismiss it with conviction. They believed it was simply nerves. Only in the woods have we ventured farther than this before we figure out a solution. The wilderness had no means of escape, surrounded them not only physically, but also emotionally. However, in all other aspects as well, the ground beneath their feet appeared to heartbeat as if it were with every stride. Conscious of their existence and alive, the air was now thicker and heavier with an stifling quiet that made each nut having turning intrusive. Nothing about the movement feels intrusive appeared normal now. But they weren't simply lost. They were being pursued. They made an effort to go back and retrace their actions, but where the way had led them, it no longer did. Previously, every turn seemed incorrect. Venture further into uncharted terrain. Once merely trees, the trees now seemed like the twisted giants that loomed branches that appeared to be grabbing. The sky above them had become darker, but the sun had not accumulated any clouds, vanished, leaving just a haunting hum. Instead of twilight, it was then that the first odd noise they heard was here's a deep growling grumble in the distance. But the men's wide-open eyes were evident, with their hearts racing in their chests. There was no animal sound coming from them. Realized it wasn't a bear's growl or something sounded like a serpent hissing. Something else completely. That mentioned a hazard that is much older and more terrible than whatever they encountered prior to Jarek. The group's youngest member was the first to talk about what that is. But Eric already was aware that his hand and face had turned pallid. Firmly grasped his knife. "And we formed an error," he murmured, his voice just above a whisper. "There's more to this than simply the forest." Her Baba Yaga started a low, strange wind to forcefully blow across the trees while carrying within them was an almost tangible sensation of danger. The roar became closer and more resonant, traversing the woods like a cautionary tale promise. The men just had one idea in mind. Imagine an escape now, but there was none. They had already fled to the jungle, and Baba Yaga's enchantment went much beyond anything they could comprehend, as they seemed to distort the world around them, to change in ways they were unable to describe. The trunks of the trees twisted, bending and twisting as though they were living and advancing to obstruct their route. The ground seemed like it was pulling beneath them, and change pulling them farther into the woods. In the middle of the forest, it seemed as if the forest was alive and led them, forcing them to face an unavoidable conclusion. At that point, they discovered it too late, that they weren't simply lost, but been damaged. The woodland has turned into a Baba Yaga, and Labyrinth were the ones who had authority over its walls. There wouldn't be any once confident. The hunters took the easy route out, and confident in themselves were now fearful and desperate. But it doesn't matter how quickly they ran, despite the amount of they attempted to combat the tremendous power that encircled them. It was obvious that they had murdered Baba. They would cover the cost of Yaga's pet. Here the forest showed no mercy. Already started to assert that they were prey in a world they were unfamiliar with, and the vengeance of Baba Yaga was drawing near. It was not a question of whether she would discover when the hunters weren't around, less certain of their surroundings. The forest was no longer merely a location where it had changed into something else, something that was no longer possible to avoid. The once familiar route was now an unidentifiable labyrinth. Every time they appeared to descend farther into the ground, as though they were being drawn in by the ground itself. The shapes of the trees loomed overhead, twisting and warping into hideous shapes that caused terror to surge through their hearts. There was only an unending sky and no sun. Shadow canopy, they fled, they ran. Since they had nothing else to could do, but regardless of how difficult the forest seemed to push them themselves to continue indefinitely, closing in behind, the hush was as they tightened their hold, deafening, only seldom broken by the rustle of invisible things or the snap of a branch. Items. But the most unpleasant aspect wasn't the actual peril, it was the recognition that they had lost control of the forest. The forest was conscious, not just alive. Waiting for Eric, who had witnessed death discovered himself in a variety of forms. Baba Yaga's stories had horrified Ayala, always appeared to him as little more than myths, stories to scare kids. But standing, feeling the heavy weight of the situation here, he knew the woodland surrounding him wasn't a myth. He had observed how the trees shifted, the abnormal change in the air. Baba Yaga wasn't merely a myth. She was genuine and serious. She continued to punish them. Leaf, unable to comprehend what was being placed, when he finally spoke, his voice was nearly tremulous. Begging that we leave this place. We committed a mistake that we were unaware of. Eric's voice was just a nasty dog. Wasn't just a puppy boy. It was cold. Grim. We destroyed something significant, and now we are being hunted by the forest, but Leaf still... He shook his head in denial. This is insane. We've gone in the wrong direction, yet we cannot be the sole ones who have undertaken the error such as this. Made Eric's eyes harden. You believe it's only about the dog. However, which of us is older than this? Said Eric with a laugh. Her dominion is the forest, but it's not just either the earth, the wind, or trees that responds to her. Everything he says sank into each of the others. Realizing how serious the situation is, it was already too late for the escape concept to dissolve. They were already imprisoned. As they staggered into the forest, the atmosphere became thicker and heavier, choking the crowd. Wind murmured something they couldn't comprehend, and it appeared like the trees were slanting with each step. The roar that became closer. They had heard a low rumbling noise previously. It had been overpoweringly still. It had made the hair stand on end. Like a ball of gray cobwebs passing through a thin cap, reverberated, but this time it was closer. It was different, intentional, and the dog wasn't an animal. Spirit, the one they so naively had slain, was now involved in a lot of beyond themselves. They had entered the realm of the witch without comprehending its regulations, without regard for authority. They were encroaching on people and time. The entire land was teeming with Baba Yaga's power. Was a malevolent force with embedded into the core framework of the pursuers. The hunt on earth was a sport, but it was also a believing that they had murdered her cat, and they would pay the hunter's steps for it. Slowed down as they started to exhaust their thirst on their hunt, they were missing their own heart. Slow, as if they were strolling through dense muck, giving the impression that the forest was depleting their power and tugging at their bodies with hands that aren't apparent. As they descended farther, the less they recognized what was taking place there. Fear clouded minds. Their perception of time drove them thought. As time went on, it became impossible to determine how far they had ran and how long they had passed. The only thing that was certain was that the forest was enormous and never-ending. Their last epiphanies, they became aware that they had been marked. They were now included in the witch's universe, and Baba Yaga had no way out. She wasn't merely pursuing them, she was enabling them to run in order to extend their lives. She was constantly in pain in the world. They would have become her prey. Slowly pass away the manner she desired, agonizingly, as the jungle encroached on Eric, had regarded them as a trap. Eric had regarded them as a trap. Slowly pass away the manner she desired, agonizingly, as the jungle encroached on Eric, had regarded them as a trap. Numerous conflicts recognized that there would be no escape or heroic last stand. Unable to battle their way out of the woods would eat them, and they'd be forgotten. The only thing that would be left was the lesson. Never question what you don't know. Recognize what doesn't work and never kill it. The trees that towered over them belonged to you. The ground below is now closer than before. Their feet appeared to beat with each step, a reverberation of the witch's strength that led them through the forest floor. As the breeze rippled across the countryside, it was dense with the odor of decay as if something in the heart was rotting. Of the woodland, and as the breaths of the guys, their steps faltered and turned ragged. They were aware that their time was running out. Something they heard prior to nightfall closed, and the distinct growl was heard, rumbling more loudly now through their bones. The dog had not just been slain. There was a fragment of Baba Yaga's soul, and the jungle would take that. The witch would ensure it for them. Baba Yaga's retribution was finished. The men's lives were wiped out like a hum. The forest's flickering spark had vanished, returned to its eternal quiet, the land's ability to recover its serene. But Baba Yaga's influence persisted. The woodland was unaltered and unspoiled, been retaliated against, and those stupid enough to, it was discovered too late that some never provoke forces